Let's return to our moderator, Clifford Sobel, former United States ambassador to Brazil and managing partner of Valor Capital Group, to talk about the Asia-Brazil connection. This session will focus on investors' perspectives. The panel is joined by Andres Esteves, co-founder of BTG Pactual, John Vasquez, Tomasics, head of Americas and head of agribusiness, Oscar Falgren, Mubadala Investment Company's head of Brazil, and Minister Paulo Guedes will also join the panel to add policy-making input. Let's join Clifford now and his panel for the second part of their discussion.
Welcome back. We will now start with our panel session with Minister Guedes. I will not do introductions again because there is so much content to cover. Our first speaker talking about his views of the economy is Andres Esteves from BTG Bank, one of the biggest banking institutions in Brazil. Andre, thank you for joining us. Perhaps you would like to give your viewpoint as to what is happening in Brazil, and then, of course, be able to ask the minister a question, which we can then open to an interactive session. Andre?
Yeah. Well, hi, Cliff. It's a pleasure being here. Hello, Minister. I will take a few comments of Minister Guedes, and just to emphasize the moment that we are living here in Brazil. You asked about inflows, Cliff, of capital in the recent 2 months. Of course, we have a very different international scenario, right? I think we moved to a more predictable end of the pandemic, with all sorts of vaccines coming to a final phase 3, and together with the end of political uncertainties in the U.S., not only the election of Biden and a more multilateral world. The third phenomenon is a synchronized growth perspective globally, right, which is quite good for commodities and at the end, quite good for emerging markets. And if you consider emerging markets, they were, as an asset class, well behind other asset class during this last risk aversion period. So this international environment created a very positive scenario for Brazil. And when you look at Brazil, you have, from the macro-micro perspective, quite interesting setup, right? First, as Minister Paulo Guedes said, Brazil will have probably something around -4% of growth this year, which is a fantastic performance given everything that all of us went through globally. And beyond that, we have an expectation of a positive 4% next year. Probably only US from the big countries is performing like this in terms of growth. Finishing the year without losing any formal jobs, I think it's a key achievement for Brazil. And if you consider on the top of that, that will have in Brazil almost 70 equity transactions in the local markets, which is among between IPOs and follow-ons, or 50 infrastructure local bonds, which makes Brazil probably one of the most vibrant capital markets in the world. So the combination of these two factors are bringing relevant money to Brazil, and which is could be an excellent moment. But my question to Minister Paulo should be, Paulo, how, of course, the fiscal situation is the yellow light on transforming this cyclical strong growth in a permanent strong growth. When do you think we'll have more concrete signals about sustainability of the fiscal situation? We have been doing a lot, and you mentioned the Social Security reform. We have an amazing pipeline of as an economic agenda. But what do you think will be the next steps that will continue to feed the market in this positive mood related to Brazil?
Well, Andre, emphasize the very important phenomenon that is going on here, which is exactly the financial deepening of our capital markets. And as Andre himself used to say, it's a world, as an environment, a financial environment that we didn't have for many decades, which is the solid single-digit interest rates. So for the very first time, you are seeing investment horizons of 10, 20, 30 years, and people borrowing in the private markets, even to pay off loans that they took in the public banks. And so it's amazing. The IPOs happening every month here are signaling enormous wave of private investments, what we call the crowding in. So after years of decades of very high interest rates, increasing tax, we've assured to invest that we will not increase taxes. We will simplify the taxes in Brazil, and we will even reduce corporate taxes. At the same time, we are deregulating the investment landscape. So natural gas, oil, electricity, cabotage, logistics, infrastructure, all this water and sewage. We just approved the water and sewage. 100 million Brazilians didn't have sewage. 35 million Brazilians did not have current water in their homes. And so we are opening, and the private investments are really taking over the old state machine. So public companies, not public, state-owned companies that went bankrupt, they couldn't finance, they are financially distressed, and they can't finance the investments. So we are getting rid of them. We are privatizing, selling. So there's a big wave of privatizations, concessions, interest rates solid single digit, simplification of tax codes, like Cliff said, double tax agreements, treaties that we are doing. That's why we are joining the international institutions. We are also aware that the exchange rate already made the overshooting. So it went already to 580, and now the flows, financial flows and investment flows are beginning to move in. So it probably peaked already. And the reforms that they're moving, we are in the midst of election at municipal levels, and the reforms keep going. Independent central bank, bankruptcy law. So we approved the bankruptcy law to simplify, because to go broke in Brazil used to be like a crime. If you go broke in Brazil, you would have problems 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And you know that is a very ordinary thing for a businessman in the US. Some of them even become presidents after going bankrupt, and there's no problem whatsoever. It's ordinary life. It's ordinary life for a businessman.
Before we change over to John and talk about perhaps his views of investing in Brazil, before we leave Andre and Paulo, perhaps do either one of you have any insight as to the trends of investing from Asia into Brazil? Because a lot of our audience is from Asia, and I'm just wondering what the trend lines have been and what your thoughts are about money coming in from Asia. And then John, who comes from Singapore, who represents Singaporean interest, will give his perspective in a minute. But Andre, Paulo?
I'll make a first comment and let the minister finish. Well, first, Asians have a long tradition of investing in Brazil. Started with Japan and then moved to all Asia. Now China is the most important trade partner of Brazil. I'm proud of having two big Asian sovereign wealth funds as shareholders of BTG Pactual for a long time, GIC and CIC, and it was an excellent relationship. ADIC was also part of that. So Asia investors are very welcome. Brazil is it's a nice place, an open place, no prejudice, a very complementary economic talents and expertise. So we produce what Asia needs to buy. Asia produce what Brazil needs to buy. So free flow of trade. A lot of international Asian multinationals are here or international companies from Asia are here. So in the energy sector, China has been the largest investor in Brazil, and Asia as a whole has been a significant part of Brazilian FDI. So for more than a decade right now. So it's absolutely welcome. Brazil is, as I said, we have functioning and vibrant capital markets. We have law enforcement. And beyond that, culturally speaking, Brazil is a very open-minded country and more than welcome for Asian investors.
Well, we have the largest Japanese immigrant colony out of Japan. So the Japanese industry, automobile industry, penetrated Brazil, then came the Koreans, now the Chinese are coming. Just to give you an idea, we had trade surplus with Asia this year of $40 billion. Brazil had a trade surplus with Asia of $40 billion. If you take Japan and China out, it's still $20 billion. So it is happening. The demand from Europe and the US went down, from Argentina went down because of the Argentinian crisis, but the increase of imports from Asia kept basically the same, constant. Brazil did not feel the shock, from the economic shock from abroad. So they are very most welcome here for an investment. And getting back to your first question too, Andre, among these reforms that we are approving now, after we fought the pandemics and we went back to structural reforms, one of the most important ones, besides all the regulatory landscape, natural gas, oil, we are changing all this mining just to open the economy to receive these Asian investments. But answering your question about the fiscal landscape, I think before the end of the year, we'll give another strong sign, still a strong sign that we are promoting the fiscal adjustment. After we reduce it as social security expenditures, interest rate expenditures, public employees, the wage bill expenditures, we are sending also a strong sign of reducing subsidies and like we call tax expenditures, subsidies in the generalized way in Brazil. So I think this will go through before the end of the year. It will be another sign. Just 2 days ago, the president gave another sign, which is announcing that after the auxiliary grants helped Brazil in the recovery, V-shaped recovery, they will be removed December 31. We've been phasing them out. We reduced them to half. And now at the end of the year, we will remove it. So we are giving the signs that we'll be removing excess expenditures with the pandemics. And at the same time, we'll be reducing subsidies. So this
if I might, Mr. Minister, let me go back to Asia a little bit and use that as a segue to bring John Vasky. Temasek has a significant office in Sao Paulo. They have made numerous investments in the country. Perhaps the question I would pose to John as he gives his views is, how have you done in Brazil?
Well, thank you, Cliff. And look, I just wanted to extend my thanks to the Milken Institute. It's a real pleasure and privilege for us to be part of this panel with my fellow panelists and the minister. As Cliff pointed out, I mean, Brazil is a place that we've operated for a significant amount of time in terms of our international presence. But, you know, maybe in responding to that, I'll talk a little bit about how we look at investments and what our mandate is as sort of direct equity investors predominantly. And that is that we're not asset allocators. So when we're looking for opportunities, it tends to be from a very bottoms up thematic approach. And we are somewhat indifferent as to whether that investment opportunity comes from the public markets, from the private markets. We're modestly indifferent as to the stage of a company's evolution. So we'll look at things in an early stage. We'll look at things all the way through to sort of well-evolved, mature companies trading in the public market. So it gives us a great deal and degree of flexibility and freedom in terms of where we deploy our capital and where the right risk return profiles are. So when we think about the themes that we set out 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, about the time we opened up our Sao Paulo office, they tended to be around 6 sort of mega trends, if you will, around the areas of social progress, so rising affluence, longer lifespans, sustainable living. A second category in the tech enablement side, so sharing economies, a world full of smarter systems, and a more connected world. And when you think about those themes, or at least as we looked at it at the time, and I would just add that those themes have, during COVID, shown great resiliency. And in fact, if anything, some of the investments that we've made, the business models have accelerated out of necessity during the COVID period of time. And so we feel good about those decisions. They weren't made with, COVID or pandemic in mind, but they certainly have made us feel better in terms of kind of where some of these economies are going. And when you think about those, areas, it's our financial services investing, which goes to fintech and payments, or allocating capital to the ag sector because, we need to feed more people on a planet that's not getting any bigger each day. Brazil represented a very significant opportunity for us to deploy capital in that regard. And so we have felt quite good about our presence on the ground there. We felt quite good about the opportunity set that we see against those trends. And we were quite encouraged with current administration in terms of some of the structural reform that's been talked about so articulately by others already in this call. So, when COVID hit, we were, again, quite encouraged that Brazil as a destiny for our capital was going to compare very favorably to other geographies in which we had a presence. I guess the question I'd have for the minister is coming out of COVID, clearly one of the other things, and that same trend analysis I just talked about, we're in the process right now of doing a very intense refresh of that. I don't think we're going to have a radical departure from those trends because I think they are ever present today, but we're going to tweak them. We're going to figure out where the white spaces are. We're going to figure out where the large addressable markets are in terms of, maybe the trends for the next 5 to 10 years. But clearly one of the themes that we're going to invest a lot against in terms of all levels and all activities is the whole area of ESG. That's going to be core to who we are. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have absolute targets from an ESG perspective, although we will have metrics that we're trying to attain. We're actually imputing an internal carbon charge to make sure that we're underwriting with that in mind. But we are also going to try to help bad actors become good actors and the like. I just wonder if the minister coming out of this and thinking about the economic opportunity, how should we as investors think about Brazil in the context of that heavy emphasis on ESG?
Tomasek is very well known in Brazil, has done a great job. It's helping a lot. It's a win-win game for us and for foreign investors that have a long horizon view. And with respect to ESG, I'll just give you an example. 2 days ago, Petrobras just announced that it's going with ESG standards, and it's basically the most important Brazilian company, state-driven company in Brazil. So even the government understands that the future is green and the future is digital. Everybody knows that in Brazil. Brazil has the cleanest energy matrix in the world. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what is going on in Brazil, in the jungle, in the Amazon. But the fact is that Brazil is a country that successfully preserved its environment for decades. And certainly we can improve. Certainly we need help from abroad. Certainly one of the reasons we are joining these international organizations like OECD, we are with the Paris Agreement. We are committed to the Paris Agreement. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's going on in Brazil. From the environment viewpoint, from the ethnic viewpoint, 14% of the Brazilian territory is populated by 0.4% of the population, which is the native population, the Indians. So nobody could say that they are not being very well treated. They have extensive territories. They preserve their territories. When the military talk about the jungle, they talk especially in terms of sovereignty. They think, well, this is our territory, and this is misread abroad. This is our territory and we are going to burn it. It's not this at all. This is our territory, and we are going to preserve it exactly like we've been preserving. So there's a lot of illegal mining, illegal burning of the forest, and this we're going to fight very hard against.
Minister, it's important to point out how aggressive Brazil will be to deal with those issues. But from a commercial standpoint, where do you see commercial opportunities in ESG investing? Do you see any in the north? Do you see categories of business? What are your thoughts about carbon credits? And I'd be curious, and this might be a good time for Andre and Oscar, we'll get to you with your perspectives, but this is such an important segment of the business, and it's great that Temasek is so focused on it. But how is that evolving in the country? When Mubadala looks at investing, what do you look at in ESG? And Andre, do you see in the investment community a refocus to this?
I'll give an example, Cliff. Well, go on, Andre, go on.
No, please, Minister.
No. Let's go. You are in the flow.
First, I want to emphasize the core of this environmental issue. I think is related to energy, right? And Brazil has and will continue to have the cleanest energy matrix in the world among big countries, right? Or in the G20, if you want. This, I think, it's not a commitment of this government, of the past government, of the future government. I think this is a commitment of Brazilian society. So conservation of our forests or keeping the energy matrix clean, I think it's a demand more than anything else, and it will be above politicians. As I said, it will be a demand of our society. From a more practical view, to give you an example, John, we are launching the first reforestation fund to be basically deployed in Brazil. And we have a timber management unit here, which stays a part in US, part in Brazil. And we are raising money of more than institutional investors, corporate investors, companies like the big techs are deeply invested in this vehicle that will be ready to invest by mid-year next year. And the size of this vehicle could be $1 billion. So if you think of a reforestation fund of $1 billion, just a few years ago, it was impossible to think. So the move in that direction and the irreversible move in the direction of clean energy, sustainable development, good governance, social commitment and responsibility, I think is present here in Brazil. And initiatives like that, this one led by BTG, but there are others led by other leading Brazilian companies, I think will be multiplying more and more in the next years.
Andre, I think that you deserve a real a credit for, not a carbon credit, but a credit for what you're doing. John, I interrupted you, but I'm going to prime Oscar because I know Oscar is looking at investing in the energy space. So that's going to be a segue to bring Oscar in after John, you make your comment.
For us, the Americas is an important destination. As I said, we've been in Sao Paulo and the Brazilian market, not to mention Latin America more broadly, but given the importance of this theme, it's just good to know that there are those kinds of initiatives where we can deploy that capital and we can continue to support the region, if you will. So
let me throw out another question to you, if I might, before we go to Oscar. It just dawned on me. You also are responsible at Temasek internationally for agriculture, which is a very big category of business in Brazil. How do you look at the ag sector in Brazil? Have you made investments in the ag sector in Brazil? If not, why not?
No, we've looked very closely. So we do think it's an important market for that. The way we define ag tends to be maybe a little bit different, but shouldn't be surprising. We run our ag practice in terms of the investing landscape that we look right at almost right up to the consumer table. So it gets to the food supply chain. And so, when you think about protein producers, alternative proteins, all the different ways consumption can change, not to mention farming techniques, farming practices, technologies, digitalization of that sector, which I think it's in bad need of around the globe. Brazil is very much an important market and an important investable, destination for us. So it's not for lack of trying. There may be some other things. When we make an investment, we have to think about how we're going to get the liquidity out, right? So we're not getting injections of capital per se for us to make a new investment dollar. It's got to be, received through a different door, through a dividend, a monetization, or some distribution from private equity. So, thinking about, how, our liquidity stacks up is maybe one of the considerations that goes across all sectors, not just ag, but ag's a very important market for us in Brazil.
I'm going to move over to Oscar, if I might. Oscar, I'd like to get back to ESG investing, especially with the prioritization in your own portfolio, Mubadala's portfolio, in that sector. And give me, if you could, your insights, your concerns, and your priorities when investing in the energy sector.
Thank you, Cliff. And first of all, thank you to the Milken Institute for the opportunity and Minister Paulo-Guedes. So, listen, I'll address the ESG question first, and then a few other topics that are on our mind when we think about investing in Brazil. But I think on ESG, the way we look at it at Mubadala is ESG is not an item that we do due diligence on. ESG is part of everything we do. We don't do anything if we don't feel comfortable with the ESG angle. Irrespective of industry. And I think, our view when it comes to the energy investments is being a socially responsible investor doesn't mean you turn your back on any and all companies that need capital, that are in industries that are, deemed dirty by the investment community or by ESG standards. I think you can very much make a difference by acquiring companies and providing capital and support to companies that are in industries where there could be questionable practices in the past, where there is a risk of environmental impact. And those industries are not going away. I think making sure that they are under a socially responsible ownership is a very important way of contributing to the overall landscape. So I think that's our view on ESG. We're obviously focused on other forms of investment as well, but when we think about Brazil, when it comes to investing in Brazil, and we've heard a lot about the macroeconomic trends here and the important reform work that is going on, I think if we bring it back to practicalities, we've been in Brazil for the past 8 years. We have a $3 billion portfolio or so of Brazilian assets that we've invested in, and we're growing quite strongly. I think when we look at it, there are 3 questions that keep coming every single time we address an issue in Brazil or we talk to investors about investing in Brazil alongside us. And it's effectively FX, GDP volatility, and corruption/political noise. Those are the 3 main topics that come up when we look at it. And investing in Brazil for us has been very important to find a formula that addresses them. And I think very important to debunk some of the myths around it. One of the most important things we see in Brazil is that these questions are not properly understood. So if you look at the FX, first, we've seen, as Paulo-Guedes said, there was a large sort of closure of the carry trade. We saw enormous economic outflows in the early parts of the pandemic, which led to, in our view, the real weakening too much and sort of overshooting on the weak side. I think when we look at the FDI flows, we're seeing a reversal of those flows and a corresponding increase in the FX rate. So that's an important element of, I think, the strengthening we've seen now. So we continue to believe the FX is actually cheap, but the volatility is concerning. And I think we'll get to that with the minister. On the GDP volatility, and I think it's important to put Brazil in perspective, we're actually very bullish on Brazil today. We believe all the important ingredients are there to grow the country going forward. And we know that historically, Brazil has never been stable. And we don't expect it to be stable, to be honest, going forward. Brazil will, in our opinion, not become, anytime soon at least, a sort of stable slow growth trajectory type of country. It's going to have troughs, and it's going to have areas or periods of growth. I think timing them is very important for investing. Today, we're standing at one of those, or coming out of those troughs with very good dynamics around it. So we feel that there is, statistically speaking, a good chance of a pretty strong recovery here. I'm not sure we're analysts in denial, as was said in the beginning of the call, but I think we don't necessarily model V-shaped growth, but we believe there is a growth trajectory here coming. And finally, just to round up, I think when we look at where we stand today, we actually see more political stability than the world gives Brazil credit for. We think that the current administration is very pro-market. It's kind of a unique point in time for an investor in Brazil today, where we have an overly weak FX. We have a pro-market government that is doing very important reform work, and we heard some of the initiatives here today. We have very low inflation. By historical standards, almost zero. Same with interest rates. And at the same token, you find a very yield-hungry investment community shifting from fixed income to equities. And we can see that on the stock exchange. But there's a large lack of private capital. So I think one of the things that we can do, and what we're excited about in Brazil, is the opportunity on the private side where we're focused. And I think, to the topic of today, we have multiple projects where we're working with, Asian partners and counterparts to explore opportunities on the private side in Brazil. But I think one of the things that come back to us, and my question to the minister, is really what can the government do, and what is the government doing to try to curb the volatility of the FX? Even though we believe today as an investment house that the FX is cheap and it's a good entry point, the extreme volatility that we've seen is hampering for foreign institutions' ability to take decisions to move into the country or gain confidence with Brazil as an investment destination.
Well, let me make a few comments. I'll begin for the last one, foreign exchange volatility. There were two waves. The first one was exactly when we lowered interest rates and people began unwinding the arbitrage funds, because Brazil, for 20, 30 years, one of the main sources of profits for banks. André knows that because I was the older guy at the bank, at Pactual Bank, when André was the bright young partner. And he knows that when I was younger than his age now, we were already making money, borrowing abroad and lending to the government at very high double-digit rates. So when we finished these arbitrage funds, $70 billion moved abroad, and the exchange rate moved from 283, 320 to 5, 5.5, 5.5, where it is in the last few months. So it was quite natural to us that the exchange rate was overvalued for decades. When you saw Asian countries like Japan, like China, they appreciate an undervalued currency. Brazil was the other way around. While Asians were creating jobs, expanding exports for decades with an undervalued exchange rate, exactly because they sent money abroad. As they promoted, as they succeeded in having great trade surpluses, immediately they financed deficits elsewhere. For instance, borrowing bonds in the US, financing real estate in the US, sending money to Brazil. So we were in the other side of it. We were with an overvalued exchange rate for decades. So of course, when we changed these major critical prices to low interest rates and high and more realistic exchange rates, it was a big shock to the market. So the initial wave of volatility was just, it's a once and for all jump, but it scared a lot of people. And then the pandemics came. And when the pandemics came, there were a lot of not only problems, but also expectations. A lot of people, like Cliff said, they forecasted drops of, the IMF said the GDP drop in Brazil would be 9.5. Some Brazilian banks estimated even more than 10% drop. And people thought that probably it would take 1 to 2 years before Brazil could experiment a recovery. So that's why there was a huge volatility. But I think markets will calm down now. People understand now.
Can I ask a question and drill down a little bit on this, because you've spoken about it before, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time, and I'm not sure, you may be able to make another point. You've looked at, in the past, reducing volatility by giving long-term infrastructure investors the possibility of hedging their investments over the longer term. Has the government made any progress in developing an actual program for long-term hedging? Well, if so,
Yes.
I think we'd all
Yeah.
would love to hear it.
Yes, yes. We know that the first risk is a political risk. The second one is the foreign exchange. The third one is legal. So we understand the foreign investor perspective, and we will take care of all of them. Volatility will be reduced from now on because fundamental reforms are being in place now. And the major jump, once and for all, which was this shift from an overvalued exchange rate to a more realistic one. It happened already. It's once and for all. It happened already from 3 to 5. Now, the other volatility with respect to GDP and the pandemics is quite natural. But also now we have an economy that last quarter, it jumped at 7.7%. So Brazil is really skyrocketing, getting out of the big fiscal hole and out of the big pandemic hole at a high speed. So as this investment horizons improves, I think things will calm down. And also with respect to
hedging, long-term hedging.
Long-term hedging, we already talked to the central bank. And of course, the central bank could pretty well design an exchange rate clause or facility like we call, so that if you come to make dollar plus 10% a year, or 12 or 8% a year, you'll be able to buy hedge, long-term horizons hedge. I think the private sector will be very soon supplying that, but we'll be there to offer that also, because we think it's reasonable. If you invested 10 years in a country and we are about to get out, something happens, you don't deserve to lose that money at all. And the other way around too, if at the end, instead of making dollar plus 8 that you were estimating, you make dollar plus 25, we would be very happy to take the change for us. So we will be very soon offering you this clause.
Andre, are you going to beat the government into offering it at BTG?
I understand this new facility, but I think, as Paulo said, I think soon the market will provide that. And with these levels of exchange rate, as we push out the anomaly of ultra high interest rates and move it to this solid single digits environment, I honestly think we'll get to the normal volatility, right? I don't think this is crucial for long-term infrastructure investment.
Oscar, as we're wrapping up, would it make a difference to you in making more investment opportunities, decisions with the ability to either hedge or obviously a reduction in the volatility of currency? How important is that for both of you?
Look, I'm happy to go first. I mean, for us, it's critical. I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, we've done very well locally in terms of our investments, but because we're not always in control of the time frame by which we monetize, those considerations always have to go into our investment decisions as relates to risk factors. So anything that could create a more stable environment in that regard, with a little bit more predictability, knowing nothing in life is perfectly predictable, or structures to allow us to lock some of that in, I think it would be viewed very favorably.
Oscar?
Listen, from our perspective, anything that can be done to help manage the FX is very helpful. I think, we as an investment house are pretty comfortable with the Brazilian real and taking a view on it. But I think it would be very helpful in terms of bringing further partners to transactions we're looking at and investors to Brazil. So that's something we would very much welcome.
Well, I was worried if we were going to make headlines again with this session. The last session the minister did had 600 media hits and 73 million individual hits. It's going to be a hard record to beat, but I think after the last part of this conversation, there'll be a lot of interest. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. I think this was great. I only wish we had another hour, and I want to leave the last word to the minister, Minister Geddes.
Thank you, Cliff. It was a great pleasure talking to you. Foreign direct investment, especially from Asia, like we're talking now, most of the audience is from Asia, will be very well received in Brazil. We already consume your goods. You already consume. It's a very complementary economies. We know the axis, the growth axis of the world now is still to that region. 3.5 billion Eurasians just jumped into global markets. We are late for this big party. We will dance with everybody in this party. We have to catch up with the time that we lost. We want to integrate our economies. With respect to the corruption, it is a thing of the past in Brazil. Last year and a half with our government, you did not have one case of corruption. Exactly because Brazil is evolving into a more sophisticated society. We'll be privatizing. We just joined the GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement, global standard for eroding corruption. We believe that a market-driven economy is much less corrupt than a state-driven economy. So we are with our arms open to receive foreign investments. We are not in a hurry. You can come leisurely, each one looking for his business. We are not in a hurry at all. We understand that we have to raise the economy by our own reforms, internal reforms. Brazil is a strong economy. Brazil used to be for 2, 3, 4 decades in the last century, the fastest growing economy in the world. We used to grow more than China, Japan, Korea, and we welcome their growth now. We went the wrong way. We are back to the trail, and we are ready to work together. With respect to the final ESG comments, Brazil has already more than 10% in solar and wind energy. So we already had a very clean, because it was hydroelectric, we had hydro energy. And now we are also, the next frontier on investment in Brazil is solar and wind energy. And guess what? Most of the panels from China. So all over Brazil, we are covered by Chinese panels, solar panels, and that's the future. We are going that direction. Now we'll be talking about 5G. We don't want to lose the digital revolution. Brazil is the third largest digital market, the fourth largest digital market in the world, as the US, India, China, and Brazil. So we are ready for the next wave, and we are waiting for investments. Like I said, no hurry, all facilities, one by one, and the new frontiers of the clean energy, which is digital, it's clean, it's ESG investments.
Mr. Minister, it's a great way to wrap it up. Congratulations on the third quarter's increase with GDP. Congratulations on the autonomy bill finally passed by the legislature. And thank you all again for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Clifford. That rounds up the two-part discussion on the Asia-Brazil connection, covering opinions from policymakers and investors.